One of the reasons that financial sanctions work, just to be totally candid, is that we have the world's most important economy, the world's most important financial sector. The U.S. dollar is the currency of choice for a huge proportion of international transactions. Those dollar transactions, whether the transaction is between Belgium and Azerbaijan, if it's a dollar-denominated transaction, it's going to come through New York. And so we have an enormous positional advantage in developing financial sanctions here in the United States because we have jurisdiction that expands around the world. That being said, for sanctions to truly be effective, you need international buy-in. You need other countries not just to be forced to have their businesses and their people subject in some respect to our sanctions in some instances, but you want those countries to embrace the policy objective. That was critical in the Iran context, and you can see it as an important part of the discussion with North Korea. And so going back repeatedly to the UN Security Council to get resolutions that impose sanctions and that also, importantly, these resolutions don't just impose sanctions, they also establish the international community's uniform judgment on what North Korea is doing. And that is an important aspect of developing this policy consensus so that you have countries around the world magnifying what we're doing domestically with what they can do under their own laws.
So if I don't want to put certainly words into your mouth, but what I'm getting a sense of is, number one, when you're trying to impose and persecute your international strategy, number one, you should have a strategy. But then that gets to the question as to what that strategy is.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it can be to achieve a certain foreign policy objective. But then you're also asking or you're implying that economic sanctions may not necessarily be the best tool to use if what you're trying to do is not necessarily change behavior, but to either express opprobrium or to punish just for the sake of punishing.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the fundamental precepts of sanctions is that they're not punitive. Okay? The idea underlying sanctions is they're administrative action. I mean, so we're in a law school. I'll do like a 30 seconds on the law part here, right? When the basic governing statute is IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, that gives the president the authority to issue an executive order that then delegates the authority to impose sanctions. It's an administrative process. The Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Treasury Department is an administrative agency that actually applies the sanctions based on the executive order that the president signs that sets out the criteria. But the idea is that if the person who is subject to the sanction changes their behavior and is no longer doing whatever it is that got them sanctioned, that the sanctions will be lifted, they'll be delisted. And OFAC every year delists hundreds and hundreds of people and companies because they have made the case that they are no longer doing what it is that got them sanctioned. So bearing in mind that the idea behind sanctions is to change behavior, it isn't a great tool to punish. And it, frankly, I think confuses the use of sanctions and in some respects impairs the ability to get international consensus around the use of sanctions if it is viewed as purely a punitive tool.
To that end, and this gets back to our initial question because I think there's a lot more to flesh out, what is it about the sanctions, and I guess we can go country by country, but do you see any limitations in the sanctions strategy in terms of achieving even the objectives that you sought and your colleagues sought in the Obama administration? Do you see any deployment of the sanction strategy now that would at least undermine some of the U.S. Policy interests and strategy that you had 6 to 9 months ago? Beginning,
Yeah.
I should start with North Korea.
Yeah. Look, so North Korea is to state the obvious, a really interesting case. North Korea has been subject to sanctions for many years, and there's some view among those who follow this that sanctions have been totally ineffective, and that sanctions cannot be part of the solution to the North Korea problem. My view is that that's not right. That if you allow for the possibility that there is a negotiated resolution of some sort with North Korea that will tamp down the danger of a basically uncontrolled North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile program, which is, I think, a very small possibility. I mean, I think today Kim Jong Un is not so interested in negotiating about his nuclear program. And it may be that he's never interested in negotiating about his nuclear program. But my view is that we should test that proposition. But to test it, we need to have a qualitatively different approach to sanctions on North Korea, not the sort of continued additional designations of this person or that entity or even this bank, but to really significantly ramp up the pressure on North Korea. And we can talk about how to do this, but it is doable. It is not the case that North Korea is sanctioned out or the most sanctioned country in the world or anything close to it. There's a lot that is left.
I think a lot of people are very curious now. So
sure.
What kinds of additional measures could be taken?
So we could essentially, so let me back up. Okay. What North Korea needs is the ability to sell arms, labor, and some textiles to earn cash around the world. Okay. It needs to then take that cash, put it into foreign bank accounts, use it from those accounts to purchase things to then ship back to North Korea, because the North Korean economy is not self-sufficient. North Korea is relatively isolated. It cannot sustain itself on what it has domestically. It needs to bring in both material from overseas to make its economy run, and importantly, Kim Jong Un needs to bring in luxury goods to keep the elites and his party, seniors happy with him, to essentially bribe them. It's about a $5 billion economy that they're running annually. All of those transactions require access to the international financial system. The North Korean won is not accepted by anybody around the world. If you want to buy a Mercedes to import into Pyongyang, there isn't a Mercedes dealer in the world that's going to take the North Korean won. Okay? They want dollars. So what the North Koreans need to do is sell what they can sell, whether it's labor, arms, coal, whatever it may be, earn foreign currency in a foreign bank account, spend out of that foreign bank account, and bring that material into North Korea. All of that is vulnerable to sanctions in a way that we have not tried to heretofore to go after. Principally, it is through the use of secondary sanctions. So secondary sanctions are designed to affect transactions that don't directly touch the United States. So the best example, going back to Iran again, is we designated, a business in Iran for supporting the Iranian nuclear program. So that entity is cut off from the U.S. Any bank account they have in the U.S. is frozen. They're cut out of the U.S. financial system. That's a primary sanction. The secondary sanction says to a foreign business or a foreign bank, if you do business with that designated Iranian entity, it doesn't have to involve the U.S. in any way, but if you do business with that designated Iranian entity, we're going to cut you off from the United States. Okay? Very powerful tool. We used it to great effect in the Iran context. We could use it in the North Korea context. The rub, and what makes it difficult, and frankly the reason that it hasn't been done yet, is unlike Iran, which had sort of a network of banks and businesses that they dealt with around the world, North Korea's financial and business relationships are highly, highly concentrated in China. 90+% of their trade is with China. That is their outlet for financial transactions as well. So if we were to really try to squeeze North Korea by imposing secondary sanctions on those entities that are facilitating the activities of designated entities in North Korea, we would be taking action against Chinese entities. Again, my view is that we need to bite the bullet and start doing some of that to persuade the Chinese to be more aligned with us in trying to bring to bear the really intense pressure on North Korea that will then put Kim Jong Un to the choice of, does he want to continue this nuclear program, ballistic missile program, at the risk of essentially the stability of his regime, or like the leaders in Iran, does he want to explore the possibility of some kind of negotiated resolution where the sanctions get relieved in exchange for real serious constraints on his nuclear and ballistic missile program?
Certainly along those lines.
Sorry, it's a long answer to it.
No, it was a fantastic and very thoughtful and comprehensive answer, which raises a number of larger issues and also questions that are specific to China. One of the larger issues is the question, given the prevalence and the popularity, the reliance of the U.S. dollar, to what extent do we, or would the United States, or should the United States consider more muscular approaches that leverage its strengths in the banking system, as well as perhaps access to SWIFT and payment systems? I know that's generated a lot of controversy, certainly with our European friends.
Yeah.
And then related to that issue is China's efforts to build up its own international financial infrastructure for its currency, the renminbi, to sort of popularize it. Mm-hmm. And at what point in time does that provide an alternative outlet for financial transactions parallel to the United States?
Right. And that's one of the real, I think, interesting questions about the long-term utility of financial sanctions is, does it spur the development of alternative systems for international transactions? Does it reduce the use of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, and the renminbi coming? There was a period where we thought that the euro would overtake, but that seems not to be much of a risk today. But it's not. But it's both the currency and so clearing and settlement systems that can grow up that exclude the United States. I think it's a super interesting question. It's one that I think economists have debated. I think there's a real risk to it, but the way to reduce that risk is to go back to something we were talking about earlier, which is to ensure that you have policy agreements internationally, multilateral policy agreements about the objective that you're using sanctions to achieve. If you have that, then the incentive to find a way to protect yourself and protect your businesses and your financial institutions from the reach of U.S. sanctions is reduced, because they're not just U.S. sanctions, they're international sanctions, and the institutions that are on the receiving end of a sanction are ones that you, the foreign country, agree have earned that that penalty. So, but there is a real risk there, and I think it's one that we need to be mindful of as a country as we continue to use sanctions.
And it's part of that larger dialogue, and one of the strategic questions with sanctions in North Korea. The United States points to more that China can do. China points to what it thinks the United States can be doing a little bit more. And it sounds like what you're really doing is saying, well, they both perhaps have a point in the sense of the United States in terms of its imposition of its sanctions, but also working with the Chinese in their own backyard.
Yeah. Look, the Chinese have a very legitimate perspective on North Korea. It is a neighbor. They have concern about the North Korean society, such as it is, collapsing refugee flows. I think they have a concern about the collapse of North Korean government and a bunch of loose nukes. I think we share some of those concerns. The Chinese are also worried about what comes next. Is there a unified Korean peninsula under Seoul's leadership? Something that they're not terribly interested in. And I think what we need to do with the Chinese, and frankly, the lack of personnel in key positions in our government makes this more difficult. But what we need to do with the Chinese is to work the diplomatic angle with the Chinese and say, look, we understand your concerns. You need to understand our concerns, how seriously we're taking this. We feel compelled to do more here. We don't relish putting sanctions on Chinese entities, but we're going to have to do this if you don't help us with a approach to the North Korea problem that puts us in control. Now, it ain't easy, right? I mean, even if the Chinese were to say to us, we're on board 100%, let's do it, there's a lot of work that needs to get done there because the relationship between the Chinese and the North Koreans, in particular Kim Jong Un, is not great. But we can't solve this problem without the Chinese coming along with us. And I think there's a combination of carrots and sticks with the Chinese that we need to deploy.
Well, moving a little further afield to Russia, and returning to this question about strategy as well as the actual instrument, and your observation that the tactic is not the end.
Yeah.
What do you see? Well, number one, I think that from an outside observer, that the Russia sanctions issue is complicated in large part because you have, on the one hand, issues tied to Ukraine, while at the same time here domestically we have questions about the hacking during the election. I guess for the record, was there hacking during the election?
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
I'm trying to establish facts.
Right.
Yeah.
I will say I would encourage everybody, if they haven't done it, to read the declassified version of the intelligence community assessment that was issued on January 6th, rather, of this year. It is, having seen the highly classified version, I can tell you the declassified version is really good. It has the essence of the report that was provided to then President-elect Trump and to President Obama. And it concludes with high confidence, right? And this was the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and the DNI, that Putin himself set out to interfere in our election and did so, I'm not going to get the language precisely right, but did so through the use of info. The first objective was to undermine our democracy, right? It was not a Clinton-Trump thing. The number one objective was to undermine our democracy. The number two objective was to harm Clinton and correspondingly to help Trump. That objective of undermining our democracy is still the Russians' objective. They're still at it. They're at it here. They're at it overseas. They have been doing it overseas previously. It is, a hugely important national security issue for this country, and I get sort of pissed off, frankly, when I talk about this. The fact that this country and this government and this administration, the current administration, hasn't gone after this issue like the national security threat that it is deeply disturbing, because what the Russians want more than anything is to destabilize this country. And we saw it in the last election. We're going to see it again in the 2018 election. We see it in Europe. This is the Russians' MO. They're very good at it. And if we continue to sort of blithely think that we can ignore this and not take it seriously, and to some extent, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. There are those who are taking it quite seriously. It's going to get worse. And we as a country need to recognize that.
Certainly there were some steps taken by the Congress.
Yeah. Sorry, you had a question?
Yeah. In light of the national security threat posed by not just past interference and our national dialogue in terms of moving through that interference, but also preparing ourselves for a potential second or third wave of interference. I guess number one, and I think I'm trying to the extent possible, and you can tell me whether or not it's not a correct wave. I'm going to try to disentangle Ukraine for the moment from the hacking, and you can tell me if that's a wise way of taking it. I'll just focus on the hacking for the moment. How would you view the steps that have been taken, if not through the executive branch, at least through the congressional branch?
On the hacking, in particular, the congressional steps,
Yes.
I think have been, it's a work in progress, I would say. I mean, I think, you've got both the Senate and the House Intelligence Committees in the course of inquiries. I think the Senate is probably further along than the House on this. I'd be interested to see what they come up with at the end for recommendations. I think one good recommendation that's out there right now is for there to be an obligation on the intelligence community to report out if there is intelligence showing that any foreign government is interfering in the election through the use of cyber or other means. So one of the things that we confronted was there was no playbook for this, and we saw this. We wanted to, working with obviously with the policymakers in the White House, we wanted to alert the American people to what was going on, but we were hugely cognizant of the risk that doing so could be viewed in the context of an election as a political move. And we were, absolutely dead set that we were not going to let the intelligence community and our assessment of what the Russians were doing be viewed as a political step, because it wasn't. And so there was the October 6th statement or October 7th statement from the DNI and DHS, but there was a lot of difficulty in sort of figuring out exactly how to do this. So I think one thing that Congress has been thinking about is a requirement to report out so that my successors don't have this difficult decision about whether to speak or not. Legislatively, and I think this is where the cyber and the Ukraine issue come together. I mean, Congress did, in the legislation that was passed a month and a half ago or now or so, have some provisions in there on cyber hacking. They were mostly codifications of existing executive orders. They didn't do much on to give new tools, essentially, or to impose any sanctions. Can I use just a little digression onto the legislative side of things? Like one of the trends in sanctions right now that I think is worrisome is the role that Congress is playing. So, and let me be really clear about this. Congress has a hugely important role in foreign policy and in sanctions policy in particular. Legislation that Congress has enacted over the years has been enormously helpful, whether it's IEPA, which we talked about earlier, or laws that were passed in the Obama administration that gave us new tools to, particularly in the Iran context, to go after Iranian oil sales and go after the ability of the Iranians to earn revenue from the oil that they were able to sell. That legislation was crafted in a way with a lot of interchange back and forth with the Treasury Department that allowed there to be some flexible application of the tools. It gave the executive the ability to, turn up, turn down, modify within, the parameters that Congress set, which is entirely appropriate, but it allowed the executive to faithfully execute the laws and to be able to have some nuance in how this played out. The Russia legislation that Congress enacted earlier this year that the president signed because he had no choice, by a hugely veto-proof majority it was passed, moved Congress into a place where they're much more prescriptive in what the executive needed to do. There's still a little bit of play in the joints, but it's much narrowed down. And it's both substantively and procedurally. So substantively, Congress codified a series of executive orders that had previously had sort of discretionary authority, and they tried to make it mandatory, some mandatory secondary sanctions. And I think really, in a worrisome way, procedurally, Congress took on the role of checking the executive and checking the Treasury on either licenses that OFAC may grant to relieve a little bit of the way the sanctions would apply, or on delistings, taking people off the sanctions list. Now, Congress felt the need to do that, I think, for good and valid reason. There was a real fear that President Trump was going to relieve a bunch of the sanctions on Russia without having seen the change in policy that we were looking for with respect to Ukraine and Crimea. But it is a unfortunate consequence of the Trump administration and the president in particular's approach to Russia that Congress felt the need to sort of tighten down the sanctions legislation in such a way that I think it becomes very difficult for the administration now to use that tool in the flexible way that I think well-designed sanctions authorities can be used.
So in other words, by keeping a check on being able to unwind the pressure, it also at the same time removes a tool for economic diplomacy that ultimately, when you're trying to